I will give you all some insight into what goes into preparing for a presidential visit at an airport. Now, for 10 years, I was the director of public safety at the Lehigh Valley International Airport in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And during that 10-year period, we had received a number of visits from dignitaries and presidents, including President Bush and President Obama. Now, I've been retired for 7 years, so I wasn't up there for the visit of President Trump. So the information I'm going to give you is my experience from about 8 years ago. I don't know if it's changed, but it's probably pretty consistent to what airports have to go through, especially a smaller airport like Allentown, for a presidential visit. So the way it worked for me was.
Want me to bring up the video, the pictures yet?
Not quite yet, Bill.
Okay.
I'll let you. About 2 weeks prior to the presidential arrival, I was contacted by a Secret Service agent. And the Secret Service agent who contacted me was in charge of the airport, and just the airport. There are quite a few Secret Service agents who are involved in a presidential visit. One or more may be in charge of the airport where the president is arriving. One or more may be in charge of the transportation from and to that airport. One or more may be in charge of the various locations where the president would be visiting. And then there's a Secret Service agent that's the head boss. And there may be other Secret Service agents involved that I won't get into. But about 2 weeks prior to the president's arrival, I was contacted by the Secret Service agent in charge of the airport. And he passed along to me the date and time of the president's visit, along with roughly the amount of time AirForce1 would be on the ground. I took him on a tour of the airport so he would understand the key areas of concern that he should be interested in. Not only the general layout of the area of the airport, but also the place where AirForce1 would taxi and stop and let the president and his entourage off, and the gates involved in the presidential entourage leaving and returning to the airport. The Secret Service agent would also check out the area that the AirForce1 was going to be parked, to check out line of sight issues. And by line of sight issues, I mean if the Secret Service can see AirForce1, then anybody that wants to do harm to the president can see where the president's going to be. So they wanted to check out line of sight issues that could be potential problems, so they can set up teams of personnel that would be either in that location or make sure their SWAT teams, the Secret Service SWAT teams, would pay attention to those areas with their binoculars and sighting devices. He would ask me of the names of the personnel that would be involved with a presidential visit, particularly those who would be on the tarmac where the AirForce1 would park, which would include not only my police officers, certainly myself, my firefighters, but also any ground personnel that would be handling the aircraft and any fueling personnel that would be refueling the aircraft. They would run all those names through their database to make sure there were no security issues involved with any of those personnel being near AirForce1 or the president. And after that, then I would sit down with the director of the airport and the department heads and let them know roughly what was going to happen so they could prepare their personnel for the arrival. About 1 week out of the president's arrival, there'd be a mass meeting with the Secret Service, the state police, and all the local police departments that would be involved in the presidential visit, as well as myself representing the airport. And they would go over various details of the trip, the locations where the president would be visiting, the routes that the president would be driving, any road closures that were required during that presidential motorcade, and any security issues that came up during their review of the area. They'd go over contingency plans, and with the Secret Service, they have contingencies on top of contingencies. So if one plan, or plan A, for example, goes wrong, then they have plan B, and they can revert to plan C and so forth. There's always a subsequent plan of action to take during a Secret Service visit with the president. During that, or at least after that meeting, then I would get together with the head of the SWAT team detail, or details that would be at the airport. And he would come back to the airport with me and review the locations where the SWAT teams would set up on airport property, as well as, again, looking over the line of sight issues that would be of any concern to him. Now, during that week, obviously, there'd be a lot of preparation at the airport. There'd be plans made where to have the central operations area, if you will, or their main communications area. And they would put their own phone lines into that location, so they would have direct contact with Washington and whomever else they needed to during the president's visit. That would be in addition to the electronic communications that would be ongoing from inside Air Force One during the president's visit. I'd get together with my personnel and give them their assignments. I'd meet with the ground personnel who would be handling or dealing with Air Force One, so they knew what their assignments were, and basically just getting ready for the visit. I can say that during President Obama's visit, there was a line of sight issue from the cargo ramp that the Secret Service were concerned about from across the street where B. Braun was located. And because of that, we had moved about 20 trucks, tractor-trailer trucks, alongside the fence on the cargo ramp, so that there would be no direct line of sight from B. Braun over to Air Force One. So that would happen during the week. Now, on the day of the arrival, obviously everybody is on high alert, but I'm getting ahead of myself. About 2 days before the arrival of the president, and Bill, you can bring up the aircraft.
Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to mute everybody and mute all. And I got to unmute. Skip, you got to unmute yourself, Skip.
I got it.
Where is Skip? Oh, there you go. All right, you're on, Skip. Let me bring up, I have to do the screen sharing. Hopefully this will work out. There you go.
A couple days before the arrival of the president, this aircraft, C-141 Starlifter cargo plane, would arrive at our airport. You can go to the next slide, Bill. This aircraft would land at our airport, taxi up to a pre-designated location, and you can go to the next slide, Bill. And it is packed with Secret Service vehicles. Not only Secret Service vehicles, and you can go to the next slide, Bill. It just shows it shows the beast, if you will, the Secret Service presidential limo being offloaded from that aircraft. But also what is on, or at least what was on that aircraft when I was there, was a smaller version of Marine One. And they offloaded that helicopter and basically put it into a hangar that it would be available immediately for a presidential departure in the case of an emergency. Now, during that week, obviously, everybody's on high alert. On the day of the arrival, the SWAT teams set up to their locations. And Bill, you can bring up the next slide. AirForce1 is only designated AirForce1 when the president is on board, but this is what typically everybody understands as AirForce1, C-747. And you can bring up the next slide, Bill. You wouldn't think an aircraft that size and that weight could land and take off from an airport the size of Lehigh Valley International, but that's that plane on our cargo tarmac during a previous presidential visit. Could have even been when Obama got there.
That was 2004.
2004?
Yep.
Okay. The next was obviously on this current visit, President Trump got off of Air Force One, and then you can go to the next slide, Bill. Obviously, all the vehicles in the president's entourage are all lined up. They're ready to approach Air Force One at their designated time and wait for the president to get off of Air Force One. Okay, Bill, next slide. Now, this is the shot, the photo of Allentown when President Trump arrived at Lehigh Valley International Airport. Does anyone, of course you're all muted so you can't respond, but just think about that picture. Does anyone see anything odd about Air Force One in that picture? I'll give you a couple seconds. You probably already have figured it out, but that is not a 747. That, in fact, is the vice president's plane. It's a 737, or 757, I'm sorry. The president chose to come to Allentown on that aircraft instead of the typical 747. And I don't know why. It uses less gas, costs less to maintain, costs less to fly. But bottom line is he chose to arrive at Allentown in the vice president's plane. Okay, Bill, you can go to the next one. And of course, everyone, I think, who has seen the president on any kind of motorcade recognizes this beast. And that's what its designated nickname is, the beast. It's the presidential limo. And it's one super car, if you will. I mean, when it was one of the vehicles obviously offloaded from the cargo ship, a cargo aircraft prior to the president's arrival, and I got to get an up-close look at it, and it is one a vehicle that, I mean, if you're going to be under attack, that's a vehicle you want to be in to be under attack, because that'll withstand pretty much anything. And you can go just back to the normal screen, Bill. Now, obviously, on the day of the arrival, prior to the president arriving, not only are the vehicles pre-stationed, but also the invited guests are put into a certain corral, if you will. The media is put into a certain corral, um, and the explosive detection teams, the canine teams, are and have been for hours checking all the vehicles that would be involved in that presidential motorcade. A lot of times there's full 44 passenger buses involved, depending on how many of the media are going to be accompanying the president. And every one of those vehicles is checked out by an explosive detection team to make sure there's no problems with any of those vehicles. So once the president lands and Air Force One taxis over to the cargo area, then the president, obviously the vehicles pull up, the president gets ready to depart. And I'll give you one tense area or tense time that occurred during when President Obama arrived. After Air Force One landed and was on the tarmac at the cargo area, the Secret Service agent right next to me said to me, there's an airport vehicle coming up the taxiway toward the tarmac. He's not authorized. If he doesn't turn around, our SWAT team is going to disable that vehicle. Got a little tense. So I got on my radio and I said, whoever is in that ground vehicle approaching the cargo ramp, stop, park the vehicle, because you are under the watchful eye of the Secret Service SWAT team. They stopped. I don't want to guess what would have happened had they not stopped, but they stopped. And that's how serious these guys are. I mean, it didn't matter that it was an airport vehicle and that it probably had the authorization to be where they were, but all vehicles were on a stop during that time. So any moving vehicles were considered a threat. Now I'll give you a little insight about what happened also during President Obama's visit. The crowds knew that he was going to be there. And there was a large crowd that had gathered outside the gate where the presidential motorcade was going to exit. The Secret Service agent that I've been dealing with came to me and said, there's too many people out there and the state police can't move them. Where else can we exit the airport? So as part of my contingency plan, I had already selected a subsequent gate. So I advised the Secret Service agent where that gate was, and he advised his boss. The okay was given. So it must have been quite a scene from the control tower of Lehigh Valley International Airport to see the presidential motorcade coming down a taxiway and moving toward a subsequent different gate than they were supposed to be exiting from. But I alerted my police officer to unlock the gate. He had it open. We got there. The presidential motorcade left, and the protesters weren't even aware what happened or where he went. So after the president left the airport, then it's pretty calm. Everybody kind of settles down, and it's just a waiting game for the president to return to the airport. On this particular occasion, the president was actually having photographs taken with various members of the local law enforcement and state police who were assisting in his trip, and I had the opportunity to go to a particular location where the president was and have my picture taken with him, and then make my way back to the airport so that I was there, so when he would arrive, everything would be coordinated as we had earlier described. Obviously, when the president headed back to the airport and we got that word, then it was high alert again. We again brought them back into that secondary gate and brought them up the taxiway back to the cargo ramp. The president was greeted by some invited guests, and he, shook their hands and got back on Air Force One. The press who were with him got back on Air Force One, but what you don't typically see is that the president comes off the front um, door of the aircraft, and the media all gets off the back door, so you never see them come and go. The one thing interesting about this particular trip that was part of what we had to deal with was our airport does not get in 747 aircraft. So we did not have stairs high enough to get up to where the president's door would open to allow him to get out of that aircraft. So again, consulting with the Secret Service, they got a hold of Dulles Air Force Base, who brought up on a flatbed 2 stair trucks with their Air Force drivers. And so when the president arrived at Lehigh Valley International Airport, there were actually 2 Air Force stair trucks there to roll up to Air Force One to allow the president to depart, and again to allow him to get back on the aircraft when it was time to leave. Of course, afterwards, after he gets back on the plane, it's still not a done deal, because it's still the Secret Service agent's responsibility on the ground to protect that aircraft until it leaves the ground. So their vehicles would escort Air Force One as it taxied out onto the runway. They would follow basically Air Force One on the taxiway as it rolled down the runway to take off. And once the wheels were off the ground, everybody breathed a sigh of relief, and it was no longer their responsibility. But of course, now the responsibility was to get all those vehicles that had come in that C-141 Starlifter cargo plane back on to that plane. So after the president left, what arrived? The C-141. So it taxied over to a particular hangar where the smaller version of Marine One was being housed, and they loaded all those vehicles back onto that aircraft along with the helicopter and the additional personnel. And it was about 10:30 at night before it all got loaded up and they flew out of here. So that was my experience with preparing for a presidential visit at Lehigh Valley International Airport. And if, Bill, you want to unmute everybody, if anybody has any questions.
I have a question.
Okay.
After everything is done, is there a meeting to evaluate how everything went, so that, there's going to be other presidents that come to the airport, make sure what worked, what didn't work, what can you do better? And is that just within the airport staff, or also do you deal with the Secret Service to do the evaluation?
Both. Obviously, there's an inter-airport meeting that goes on between myself and the personnel that were involved, as well as the department heads. And then there's a follow-up about a week later. There's a follow-up with the Secret Service to find out, were there any glitches, or if everything went perfect. That was great too.
Hey, Skip, quick question. Fascinating story. The idea of the motorcade coming on the plane, I had envisioned them all like driving up 95 coming up here to meet the president. That's fascinating. Question: what kind of accommodations were made in the control tower? In other words,
there was a Secret Service agent in the control tower, and even though there was one Secret Service agent that was in charge of the airport, there was a second Secret Service agent in the tower.
Okay. And normal FAA controllers who would normally handle Lehigh Valley
Yes.
traffic.
Yes. Of course, during the presidential visit, all air traffic as far as takeoffs and landings were canceled. There was no other aircraft traffic at the airport while his aircraft was landing or taking off. Now,
Hey,
during the time that his plane was on the ground and he was off airport property, then air traffic was continued.
Hey, Skip.
Yes, Walt.
One of the Eastern officers that you and I worked with told me quite a few years back that you mentioned about the 750, the AirForce1 being, so big that it couldn't land up at the airport. But one of the guys that you and I used to work with in Easton had some connection either with the airport or with the presidential administration. But he told me that on quite a regular basis, the AirForce1 used to do touch and goes up at the airport. Is that something that during your time that still happened?
Oh yeah, yeah. That AirForce1 does touch and goes on a frequent basis. And I hope you didn't misunderstand what I said. Even though the president arrived in a smaller version, the vice president's plane for this visit, when I was there, he did arrive in the 747. So
you can close everything down. I don't know if I did.
the 747 can and does land at Lehigh Valley International Airport. They take off with a less fuel load because they don't need as much fuel to get back down to DC.
Give you some little information. As a former private pilot, and as a current drone operator of a small little hobby drone, as a private pilot, we are notified long in advance of things called NOTAMs, notices to airmen. And when the airport is going to be closed, airspace is closed, we aren't even allowed to fly. When I used to fly out of Braden's airport, you would be able to take off from Braden's and you had to head away from the Lehigh Valley immediately when the presidential plane was in the area. And nowadays it's worse. But as far as small drones, my drone is tied into air traffic control's flight information. And if I want to take off from my house, which is just a couple miles away from the airport, normally I can only take my little drone. I have to put a request in. It's all done electronically. I put a request in that I want to take off and fly for a hobby. And my drone will take off and only fly up to an elevation of 400 feet. The closer I get to the airport, it'll drop down to an elevation of 100 feet. And when you get to a certain point within the airport flight area, the drone won't even lift off the ground. When the flight recently for Trump was scheduled, drones were blocked. I could start the drone in my driveway, but it wouldn't lift off.
Wow.
So again, the electronics that are tied into from the Federal Aviation and Air Traffic Control. Now, I have a quality drone. You can still buy the $39 drones that have no connection to anything electronic, and they can take off and fly. And the government is prepared to shoot them down in various methods when the plane is nearby. Just thought I'd pass that along.
Cute.
I would think that it's quite expensive for the airport to have this kind of a visit. Or is the airport compensated at all for the traffic that they get?
Are we compensated for a presidential visit? No.
Yes.
No.
Just an honor.
I asked that question when the president was going to come in, and they pretty much were blunt, saying no. There's no governmental compensation to an airport for a presidential arrival, at least not to ours.
In doing the research for pictures for Skip for this, I just came across a video this morning, which I didn't even take time to edit out, but I found a video that was of the airport that was apparently allowed somewhere near the airport for Trump's visit, and it showed several of the Air Force 2, I think. Well, it's called the choppers. They had 2 of the choppers at the airport for Trump, and they probably flew them right on up from Washington. And it had 2 of the vertical takeoff twin engine Air Force planes that literally take off vertical, and as they get up in the air, the engines turn sideways. They were there also at the same time. But we never saw those on the TV news or anything like that. But I found videos that somebody had posted on YouTube.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because when the presidential motorcade leaves the airport, you can pretty much tell where they are because there's always a state police helicopter over top of them. And of course, the Marine helicopter would be in close proximity also.
Hey, Skip, just as an FYI, when he comes to New Jersey, they always, if he's coming directly from Washington, they fly that 757 in.
Do they?
Yeah.
Okay.
If he's coming from somewhere else, he lands at a local airport. If he's going to do the Washington, New Jersey run, but if he's coming from somewhere else to New Jersey, they put him at Newark Liberty International in the 747.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, my experience was both with President Bush and with President Obama that they flew the 747 into our airport.
It may just be that Easton's a little bigger than the one that they use up in Morristown because that's like a Learjet airport.
Right.
Yeah, so the runways are significantly shorter.
Right.
Steve, when President Trump started to use Morristown, they actually extended the runway to handle that 757.
Oh, I didn't know that. And the cool thing is that, and William, the vertical helicopter you brought up, in Morristown, they station them at either end of the runway. So they'll just sit there, you know, once a motorcade starts coming back, they'll go up in the air and sit there for an hour.
Wow. Another reason, Skip, you mentioned about touch and goes with the Air Force One, quote unquote, type airplane at Allentown. You'll find a lot of large military planes, the equivalent of the Air Force One, will do touch and goes at Allentown. Again, being a pilot and understanding this, Allentown Airport has a lot of the electronic facilities for navigation, and the airspace in the Washington, D.C., Baltimore area is so crowded to do practice. It's easy. The planes, I don't know, it's less than a half an hour, I guess it is, for a military plane to be up here from Washington. So instead of trying to do practice touch and goes at Dulles or the airports in the Washington area, they'll fly up to Allentown to do their touch and goes. And they didn't think anything of the big C transport planes to come up at 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night and just do touch and goes in the valley. And of course, the noise is just amazing. But it's an easy way for the military to practice, and they're not that far that they have to travel to do it.
Yeah, it's interesting because every time there was a presidential visit, I would get together with my Secret Service counterpart, and I would say, is it okay if any of my guys get to go on Air Force One and get a little tour? And the answer was always no. But the last time actually President Obama was at Allentown, I made the same request I always make. And the response I got back from the Secret Service agent is, you can go on, but nobody else. I said, well, that's not fair. What about all my guys that have been, assisting? He said, either you go on or nobody goes on. So I did have the opportunity to go on Air Force One, and that probably is a talk for a different time, but that was interesting too.